So, folks, if you want to participate in the chat, we encourage you to do so. It's always great if you sign in and tell us where you're signing in from. We appreciate it's not only is it the Tuesday before a long weekend, both in Canada and the United States, but it's also unbelievably hot in many places in the North America that aren't accustomed to heat. I don't know whether anybody's been looking at these cute little tweets that have been coming out where Vegas has been tweeting up to Seattle and saying, good luck with the heat. We're the ones that have heat, not you. What are you doing with heat? And I know we have participants here from Vancouver who are going to tell us that they don't have air conditioning and they're not accustomed to the really in the sort of oppressive nature of the weather at the moment. So on top of COVID, on top of all the kinds of eruptions that we've seen around racial injustice, around public health injustice, around economic injustice in the country, now we have this visceral presence, which it's really hard to deny isn't linked to climate change. And is this actually the future that's ahead of us? So I know people want to argue that and say, well, wait, it's not this, it's not that, but it's hard. Isn't it hard to just not ask yourselves, okay, what is the natural world saying to us? So in that context, I just want to acknowledge also that this session is an outgrowth of a partnership that we've had with Youthful Cities, because cities are all about urbanism. We say at CUI, urbanism is for everyone. And so it's important for us to have strategic partners, and Youthful Cities has been that, and they had this fantastic project that they initiated last year called Pivot with the Center for Dialogue at Simon Fraser and a number of other partners in making these connections between young people and their experience of the city and local government and municipal leadership, which we know from our own work here has put enormous pressure on city governments who had to respond through COVID and improvise like crazy and suddenly do a bunch of stuff that they maybe hadn't anticipated they'd have to do or didn't have resources to do. So I always say that through these disasters, the city becomes a big DIY project where everybody has to kind of mobilize and figure out what's going on. And so how great for us to have you, gang, joining us to give us your perspective on what are you seeing? So that those three questions, what's working, what's not, and what's next, particularly from your own perspective as a young person, but also in terms of your engagement with the youth sector or other young people working in urban environments. And I'm just going to ask everybody just individually to just give us a sense of what are you seeing? What have you been observing in the last 16 months as we've been getting through COVID? And if you could start by just telling us where you are. So I'm going to start with you, Freshta, if I could, and introduce yourself, tell us where you work, what you do, and what have you been seeing?
Thank you so much, Mary, for that kind introduction. My name is Freshta, and today I am calling from and I have the privilege to speak from the unceded and ancestral territories of the Katsi, Samyahu, Kwantlen, Musqueam, Kekwe, and Coquitlam's peoples. And I would like to also just say thank you for inviting me to this talk before I let you know what I'm doing. I'm very grateful to be here with such amazing young people doing such amazing young work, youthful work about cities, and I'm excited to have our talk today. I am currently, unfortunately, unemployed and just a researcher on the side, pursuing some projects with our wonderful work from Pivot, seeing if I could write a little bit more about it. I am a co-author of our Urban Youth Impact Report, and that had inspired me to continue doing work with our Pivot Data Hub. From more something I was doing on the side, I'm also conference assistant for the CPSA, the Canadian Political Science Association, and we just finished some conferences around 2 weeks ago. So that was a very exciting opportunity. But as of that, I'm not doing much else other than my research on urban cities and youth participation right now, so in their cities.
Freshta, can you tell us a little bit about the work of Pivot? Just because a lot of people on the call don't even know what Pivot was or is. So can you just tell us a little bit about what it was you were trying to do? And then I'll go from you. I'll go around the circle. But why don't you just give us a little primer if you can? And how hot is it there?
How hot, right. That's the other thing. I am one of those people calling from Vancouver. So it has been quite hot here. I'm a chinchilla owner. So I had adopted a chinchilla in October, and they are very sensitive to temperature. They can only survive between 18 and 21 degrees. And so the temperature has been I've been running back and forth every 30 minutes into the room where I keep my chinchilla in the basement and trying to cool him down. But it's a good example of just looking at and seeing that my poor pet is barely surviving this weather.
Fresh to just fill me in because I'm old. What is a chinchilla?
Oh, it looks like a rabbit, but it's like a squirrel rodent looking, kind of fluffy and big. And I think they were actually overhunted for the fur, but they don't.
Fur, right?
Fur, yeah.
And you've got a domestic one, and you couldn't bring him onto Zoom with you.
No, I could not today. No, it's too hot up here. But
I mean, pets, this is a big issue. Like how, and so you're just sort of trying to keep cool air for that little pet. I mean, that's
for that little pet. Yeah, I am kind of surviving by just a lot of showers and ice. Yeah. I don't have AC at home. I have a smaller AC for his room only, but no one's allowed to enter that. So
you've got your priorities right. You are air conditioning your pet. I understand. Believe me, yeah. I know how important pets are. Okay, so just tell us a little bit more about what Pivot was trying to do.
Thank you. So Pivot was a youth-based project led by Youthful Cities and in partnership with SFU JWA Center for Dialogue. And essentially, and of course, it had employed, I believe, 1,200 youth in the fall. So there was like 3 semesters with Pivot. And in the fall of 2020, that was more of a research collection data time. So they employed a lot of youth to collect not only survey data, so sending out surveys to youth-based organizations, asking youth their perspectives from 27 different cities on their time in the pandemic. And we also conducted at that time interviews. So youth were asked to reach out to their own networks and interview other young people about their experiences in Pivot. And we collected, I believe, it was 500 hours of interview data. So, we had survey data, interview data, and then at the end, we also had 23,000 data points, 20,000 to 23,000 data points on index data. So we have 3 different types of data that were basically collected, all by young people, conducted by young people, and derived from young people. So that was to create a report, which I, Raj, and Majin, who are also our co-authors for the report, worked on in April, and then also, I believe, released in May. So.
Yeah, and my colleague has just put it into the chat. So anybody that's listening, if you want to have a look at that Urban Youth Impact COVID-19 report, go to youthfulcities.com. You'll see the link in your chat. Thanks, Freshta. Majin, can you add into that? You're in Montreal, where it's also hot, I'm sure, but maybe not quite as hot as it is on the West Coast. Fill us in on what you're seeing out your door and what you're sort of observing, could you?
Of course. Yes, it is. I am in Montreal, specifically in Lachine. I don't know if any of you know of that neighborhood. It's really, really nice. And I'm lucky enough to be near the Lachine Canal. So it's a 20-minute walk. So when it's too hot, I walk by the canal, and just like the wind created by the waves gives a nice break from all the heat. But it's unbelievably hot. But I'm okay with it, rather being hot than too cold. My honest opinion. And yes, I mean, a little bit of I guess of what I've been doing so far. I'm working as a project coordinator. My goal is to bring good ideas to life, and I've been lucky enough to work alongside Raj and Freshta at Pivot, trying to do that with the report, and now moving on to other organizations that are also helping organizations in the not-for-profit sector, also collecting data points and trying to make a change. And yeah, that's pretty much what I've been working on so far. And yeah.
What is AJA?
Yes, AJA is a social enterprise based in Montreal, Canada. It works on data and technology solutions for the non-for-profit sector. I started there a month ago as a project coordinator, and basically they want to shed a little bit of light of the reality of the not-for-profit sector, because a lot of the non-for-profit sector, they have access to data, but how they use it and what they do with it, and what are other people, for example, stakeholders, people are giving them money, expecting from there. It's all this dynamic that really people need to understand a little bit better. So as a project coordinator, I'm currently working on a project that will help a lot of non-for-profit for a specific sector join forces, unite forces together to try to exchange good idea, the resources of what they do. Because it's something that I've realized since the pandemic is that for the non-for-profit sector, they've had to move from like, they have to change their approach. And a lot of people in non-for-profit sector, especially when it comes to funders and donors, I think they had a lot of added value in, going to see the donors personally, meeting them, shaking hands, explaining them what they do. But with the pandemic, that was impossible, right? The social distancing had to be observed at all costs. So literally overnight, they had to go from shaking hands, meeting people, having like hosting parties for like, getting money, to having Zoom meetings and everything. And none of them were all equipped and ready to make the change like that. So a bunch of people, they gathered together and they talk about the kind of the issue in the digital sector for the non-for-profit sector. And basically the project I'm working on is working on to address a few gaps noted in that sector in terms of skills, access to connectivity, infrastructure, and tools.
Yeah, it's going to take us a while to make sense of all this, eh? Like, I don't even know if we have any idea the impact this has had. I mean, as you say, we had to shift to digital ways of working, and at CUI we had to do it like everybody else instantly. And suddenly for us, we were working nationally, and it's much easier. Like, look, I can get all you guys on the call. I can get Calgary and Montreal and Vancouver and Winnipeg. And in the before time, I would have had to call you all and can we do a conference call? And people would go, oh, I don't really like doing conference calls. And then we'd say, well, we could have a meeting, but then we all got to figure out, well, who's got budget to fly? And gee, do we want to go to Winnipeg? And do I really have the 3 days? Because I got to get a day to get there. And I mean, I think there have been so many positives about what we've gone through. And I'm wondering if how are we going to sustain that? That's the first thing. But as you just pointed out, Imogene, the other problem is there were a lot of people who had no access to this technology. Still don't. And it's as if we've suddenly been catapulted into this new way of being, and we're leaving a lot of people behind. And how are we going to step back in and kind of thread us back, get us all on the same page, I guess, the same digital page? Boy, sometimes it can get overwhelming when you think about it, right? But I'm interested that you're focusing on this, and that the not-for-profit sector is. And there's this data piece too, which is what Pivot was trying to make the case that it has to be data-based. So Raj, can I go to you next? And then I'll swing back through Veronica and Michael. What's it like in Calgary? It's very Canadian, we either have to talk about hockey or weather or both. So if you want to talk about the Canadians, knock yourself out. I gather they lost last night, but or you can talk about the weather to start. But Raj, just tell us what's going on for you and what your role's been and what you're focused on.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. I would just like to begin by acknowledging that we are on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, and the city of Calgary, where I'm located right now, is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. And I think Freshta and Imogene have introduced Youthful Cities wonderfully, and I guess I could add on to that a little bit. Trying to put it into one sentence, Youthful Cities purpose right now is to drive positive urban change through open data and data literacy. The Pivot Hub was an example of that. As Freshta mentioned, over 20,000 data points were collected from 27 cities across Canada. I guess one thing that we really noticed from that report when we were writing that report and analyzing all these data points is a lot of things in cities that are barriers that we saw through the pandemic were really just barriers prior to the pandemic. And it's just this intertwined moment in everyone's lives that we're seeing all these things come up, especially when we're talking about diversity and inclusion, anti-racism. We're talking about public health. There were barriers. There's barriers that exist in public health in cities prior to the pandemic that impact youth and impact within that youth demographic, people of color more, Indigenous, Black youth, as well as gender-based gaps, barriers. So I think one of the things we need to quickly realize is that let's take this opportunity as we're talking about moving forward and building back better, as a lot of political figures say, and let's try to get away from that performative action and actually start engaging with the youth population. Let's start engaging with individuals and communities that have lived experiences, and bring those perspectives to the table for public policy change as we try to build our cities back from this pandemic.
Yeah. I mean, your comment there about lived experience is true of every population. You know, I think of the tragedy. Do you remember at the beginning of the pandemic, guys, the tragedy we watched that was unfolding primarily in long-term care facilities, right? And there we were suddenly confronted with an aspect of our system that seemed to be failing. We weren't keeping elders safe. And it's as if every wave of the pandemic has highlighted another vulnerable population that we didn't have adequate data or systems to protect. And it's just one after the other. And as you suggest, lived experience is the key determination here. How do we make sure that we're setting public policy with lived experience at the center? Would we have known better that long-term care facilities were at risk if we had lived experience input? Would we design our systems differently if personal support workers were actually at the decision-making tables determining how healthcare resources are allocated, so that we wouldn't have had so many essential workers at risk? It's very, very important what you're suggesting, Raj, not just for young people, but for everyone. Thank you. Veronica, let's go to you next, and then I'm going to clean up with you, Michael. You'll be the last. We'll come to the center of the country when we move forward. So Veronica, next to you, just tell us where you are, what you're working on, and what you've been observing. Thank you.
And I can't wait to jump on that theme that you were just going into.
Well, feel free, knock yourself out if you want to start there. That's good, whatever.
Okay, yeah, maybe that's a good place to start. But for intros, my name is Veronica Belitsky, and I'm joining in from the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Youth Nations, where I've lived in my whole life and where I was lucky to be born. Yes, we are in the middle of a heat wave. So in terms of what we're seeing now, I think that's the first thing that comes to mind, is that not only am I sitting with the fan in my face, but I think it's the concept of the heat wave that I've found to be additionally challenging, just knowing that this isn't the last and this isn't the worst of it. And I think a lot of youth have really been seeing and making that connection and trying to make that connection clear too to policy and decision makers. And I think it's a huge part of the reality of being a young person too, is knowing that the rest of our lives, this is what every summer is going to be looking like. So I think that you can't enter this conversation without underscoring that too. But in terms of what I'm working on, I'm here with my lens as a young person, and also I'm really lucky to get to run an organization called City Hive in Vancouver, and we work on transforming the way that young people are engaged in shaping their cities. So we work with municipalities, cities, institutions to help them engage youth in a meaningful way when working on issues like housing and affordability and climate change, and all of the other messy issues we have to work on. And then we also run programs for youth to learn about civics and how to get engaged on a local level, and to act as that bridge between young people and their institutions. And so I think in terms of some of the things that I'm seeing, I think the big one that I think comes to mind and is really front and center for me too as a young person is that just the fact that at this life stage, I think young people are always plagued with uncertainty. It's a big time of growth and transformation. And I think that what the pandemic has done is it's created an additional veil of uncertainty, which is really huge and massive when thinking about planning for different life stages, when thinking you're at a time when you're exploring what you want to be doing with the rest of your life, learning how to be an adult. And so I think having the additional veil of the pandemic, of course, has its challenges. And I think the big thing to underscore there too, and that we've already been talking about, and which I'm really glad to see the Pivot report really underscore, is the disproportionate impact that has on different populations of youth. And so although we can talk about youth as a monolith in some ways in terms of overall life stages, in no way does that uncertainty and the impacts of COVID actually impact youth in a similar way. So I think that's that's a really huge part of being a young person, whether you're in cities or elsewhere. And then I think the other thing, and I really like the question of what are you seeing outside your front door, because I think that's such a great way to be understanding what's actually happening. And I think one thing that to me feels really exciting, and that I think we've seen from the beginning of the pandemic, is this return to the hyper local. And I think that happened at the beginning with, obviously not being able to go too far away from your home, but also I think seeing really huge mutual aid campaigns and initiatives being organized in Vancouver, largely being organized by youth. Our largest mutual aid network was completely youth organized, youth led, and was really, really impactful, had a really huge impact on the city, especially in the first few months of the pandemic. And I think that's a trend that we've continued to see, in part because we have to stay local, but I think in part because people have had to turn inwards and have had to turn to their communities in a physical way.
Yeah, it's interesting listening to you, Veronica, because we can hear the wind behind you. And as I was listening, I thought, it's okay, it's fine. And I'm thinking at the time, that's a fan. She's got a fan close to her to allow her to participate. So don't worry, it's only something that I registered and thought, what is that sound? But I realized it's your fan. But
I wish it was
it's interesting what you said about mutual aid society, mutual aid efforts. We feel very strongly, as you do, that this is critical to how you build resilience in communities. And some people are now calling it, they want it to be considered infrastructure. They want it to be funded the way we fund bridges and roads and stuff, that this kind of community support thing. And we started at CUI, not only this thing, City Talk, but we also started City Share Canada. I'm hoping somebody can put that in the chat too, where we're posting examples after examples after examples of people improvising in response to what they saw out their front door, and this idea that we are all incubators of we can all incubate smart solutions, all of us. If we, Jane Jacobs had this phrase that the way you kept neighborhoods safe is you put a lot of eyes on the street. You design your city so there's always eyes on the street, and that means that people are watching. And so City Share is kind of our version of eyes on the street. What are you doing? And as you say, people instinctively find ways to help each other and to provide mutual aid. And the question, I guess, is what's the relationship between individual initiative, communities, and governments in terms of trying to make that right blend? So Michael, if I can go to you next to give us your perspective from the center of the country. I don't know what the temperature is like in Winnipeg. How hot is it?
It's normal here.
It's normal. So there you go, everybody. If you want normal, move to Winnipeg. The other thing is that I actually know, I don't know about the others, of whether other people had family members with COVID. I know, Michael, both of your parents had to get through COVID, and I'm assuming they made it through, because I haven't seen anything to the contrary, but you've had your own set of struggles, I know. And in the Indigenous communities, of course, COVID continues to be a threat in communities. But anyway, why don't you give us your perspective from your point in normal weather in Winnipeg, where the mosquitoes are getting big, I'm assuming. Yeah.
That's our provincial bird in Manitoba.
Of course it is.
Tansei, everyone. Michael Redhead Champagne Natis Nakasan. My name is Michael Redhead Champagne. I am coming at you today from the north end of Winnipeg, which is Treaty 1 territory, homeland of the Métis Nation, and prior to that, Anishinaabe Cree Dakota peoples. We also get our water from Shoal Lake 40 First Nation, and so we acknowledge the difficulties of our relatives in many communities in Canada, especially during a heat wave, that don't have access to safe and clean drinking water. So that was supposed to be a land acknowledgement, not me giving us a lecture, but here we go. Looks like we're just getting started. My name is Michael, and this is what I do. I'm a public speaker and a community organizer, and I'm passionate about systems change. And so I'm grateful to be here today. And I've been active in a number of different communities, systems, ever since I was a young person myself. I'm now at the ripe old age of 34. I'm now calling myself a youth mentor. I'm not a youth. And so it's important for me to make sure that I use my privileges to make space for young people and, amplify those voices of lived experience, especially when it's opportunities to change systems. So I'm a public speaker, I'm a host, I'm a writer, I'm a community helper, and I'm originally from Shamattawa First Nation, which means I'm also the son of an Indian residential school survivor, and I am a product of the child welfare system. And so I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge the ripples that are happening in all of our communities now as a result of the unmarked graves that have been discovered all across our country here. And I just want to say thank you in advance to all of you for being compassionate human beings and individuals who are, I'm confident, utilizing your privilege and utilizing your access to resources and getting those resources to Indigenous people today, Indigenous families today. Because it's easy to feel sad for the child that never made it home, but it's harder to feel that same empathy and humanity for the child that did make it home, because that child that made it home today is the same family that's struggling in the child welfare system today, having their kids taken away today. The child that made it home is that person who's drinking on Main Street right now, who's struggling with homelessness and substance abuse. The child that made it home still needs us today. And so my heart is broken because it's possible that that's my family in those graves. And so it is hurtful for me to see everything that is happening right now and to see all of the outpouring of love for those children. Because where is the love for the children that made it home? So I just wanted to begin by saying that I'm grateful that my mother, a residential school survivor, did make it home. But I know that my mother, actually, no, I'm not going to go there. Moral of the story is I'm grateful that I was adopted in the child welfare system by a beautiful North End family called the Champagnes. And now I carry their name as well as my family name. So I'm Michael Redhead Champagne. So that was supposed to be an introduction. But when it comes to young people and COVID-19 and how do we recover from all of this madness, it's been important for me to be a good relative to my parents as they recover from COVID-19. And so what that has meant is a lot of health-based advocacy. What that has meant is taking care of their pet. What that meant has been meal preparation. What that has meant has been driving them to appointments, taking care of their car. What that has meant has been calling the people who are in charge of their housing, the people that are in charge of their cable. It's this thing that happens, I guess, when your parents get old and sick, where you have to take care of them. And so, let's do what we can today to take care of parents that are out there struggling. COVID-19 has disproportionately affected, of course, Indigenous and Black people. We know in the province of Manitoba, 50% of the COVID cases at one point were Indigenous and Black people. And we know that we are not 50% of the actual population. And so with that disproportionate amount of COVID-19 hitting our community, it becomes important for us to get involved. So I'm involved in a campaign called the Protect Our People Manitoba campaign, and it's trying to convince and explain to specifically Indigenous people, but it's of benefit to everybody, why it's important for us to get involved in COVID-19 vaccination efforts. So I myself am double vaccinated, and I'm encouraging all other Indigenous people to get involved. But Indigenous people have a mistrust of the healthcare system, which makes it very difficult in cities to do vaccine campaigns like this. And they're rightful to be distrustful of systems because we have examples like in Quebec recently, like Joyce Echequan. Let's not forget that she was racismed to death. And so this is a horrifying reality and current contemporary reality in Canada. So when I think about young people and I think about cities, I think we have to think about how we communicate. And I know everyone here has probably been involved in reports and campaigns like myself, but I just want to give us all a lecture here for a second. We got to stop putting good ideas that are intended for young people in boring reports that they're not going to read. They're not going to read that. So we have to start thinking about knowledge translation and accessibility of information. One thing that I'd love to see more of is drip release of reports, recommendations on different social media platforms. Canadian Urban Institute has opportunity to reclaim their Instagram page. I know it's been years, but I'm calling you out here. You guys have an opportunity to reclaim your Instagram page and start doing things that get this information into visual, graphic, bright, exciting, and understandable information so we can truly engage young people in city building. The last thing I'll mention, because I could go on forever, is that I was honored to be a part of Youthful City's infiltration manual. All right, and the youth infiltration manual talks about how it's important for young people to get involved in addressing climate change at the city level. And so there are templates in there for us to be able to look at and share with young people. It was built by young people and youth mentors like myself, who have been able to infiltrate successfully municipal systems in the past. So it's based on models of success. And I even put some of my little secret tips and tricks in there too. So please take a look at the infiltration manual. And I just also want to say the language we use is important. That's called the infiltration manual. I'm not here to be nice. I'm not here to coddle people's feelings. I'm here to infiltrate a system and make life better for my community. I'm not here to coddle a system's feelings. So infiltration all the way. Let's change the system. Sorry.
I'm really hoping that I don't think systems have feelings. I hope you're, I think we shouldn't anthropomorphize systems. We should dismantle the damn things, and we create the systems that we need. So I hear the point here. Just a couple of comments to what each of you saying. One thing, this is a moment. I'm sure everybody says, oh, this is their moment, but this is a moment for young people to assume leadership, because there's a gazillion not so young people that really haven't a fucking clue what to do next. There's lots and lots of folks that really are looking for answers. It's a moment where I feel like we're at a moment where everything is up for grabs, because nobody really has the full answer. So as Michael's appropriately calling us out, we at institutions like the CUI have to become much more contemporary in terms of how we communicate. I'm not a young person, but I'm with you around liking it in drips. I like that terminology, drip, because I'm not a report reader anymore either. I just can't bother to read. And I think we have to think about how our attention spans, back to our conversation about technology, how our attention spans have changed. The other thing I want to just cite is when Veronica was talking about the heat, and whatever the particular challenge is, one of the things that I've watched with City Talk is first we were dealing with long-term care, then we were dealing with anti-racism, then we were dealing with food security, then we were dealing with transit access, then we were dealing with jurisdictional problems about was the federal government the boss or were the provinces the boss, and where were the municipal governments, and now we're dealing with discoveries of unmarked graves, and there'll be more and more and more. So all of these things are going to accumulate, and we have to find, I think, our way to understand what are the ways we can make interventions that will make things better. So I just want to suggest a book called Heat Wave that was published in the 90s, which was the first book that I think started to identify why how we build our cities matter. And it's by Eric Kleinenberg. My colleagues will put it into the chat. And it was a PhD thesis, young guy, not in a system, doing his research. The system determined that the heat wave in Chicago was completely neutral in terms of its impact. Eric Kleinenberg was like 24 years old writing his PhD thesis and looked and said, wait a sec, it's actually neighborhoods of color and neighborhoods that were poorly planned, where people where they were stuck in apartments and they didn't get out into public spaces. That's where people in Chicago died during the heat wave, because they were poorly planned communities and they happened to be racialized. And he called it out and he said, that heat wave became a particle accelerator. And I've been copying him through COVID to say that these dramatic events just basically accelerate all the things that were wrong in the beginning and that weren't functioning. And we've seen it again and again and again. So just if you want to read a book, go read that book, because it was a prophetic book. And he's gone on to be a documenter of that. Michael, do you want to respond on that?
I just want to say very quickly, and then I'm curious to hear from our other panelists, but I just want to say, I have a quick model that I want to share with everyone that I think would help us address the lived experience, especially young people factor as we move forward.
Okay.
So in my model here, okay, it's 3 circles layered over top of each other. In the center, we have people with lived experience, all right? They have the most power, the most influence. That's what this is called, the circle of power and influence. And so people with lived experience are in the middle. They have the most power, the most control. The next layer are people that are formerly lived experience. So in the conversation with youth, well, young people have the most power and control, or they should. When it comes to young people, the people who are the closest to being former youth would be the ones, and then the people that are not youth at all anymore would be the least power. And what I love about this is that the non-experiential people end up being that protective layer to the outside world and other external harmful systems to protect people with lived experience. And the people with the former lived experience are there kind of building that bridge in between those two groups. And then the lived experience, their job is to be themselves and say what works, what doesn't work, real talk. So I just wanted to—
Wait, Michael, keep that up, because what I would say is I'd like to use the same concentric circles in terms of place-based approaches. So the people, from my view, that are prime on policy should be the people living in the local community. They're in the center. And then the next people out would be the people that have familiarity with that local community and become advocates on behalf of what the local community wants. And then the outside buffer would be the decision makers that have never set foot in Winnipeg, but are listening to the people in the region who are telling them that this is the reality. So I would use those same circles in terms of how we build cities from the ground up, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so can I open it up to everybody, please, and just have a general, if you can just throw in a couple of ideas. When you look at what wasn't working or what you think is not working for youth in cities, what would you say would be the couple of key things that your experience would inform? And I can call on a few of you if you like. Freshta, why don't you start? What do you think? And let's try to see if we can pick some priorities, because it's hard. There's lots that's not working, right? But
well, I think for me personally, something that Pivot highlighted was the role of young people in creating public policies. We just talked about accessible language and infiltration, and something that I've realized is that, and also on the book of Heat Wave, something I did after Pivot was walk around my neighborhood a lot because I started running. Majine was the person that actually encouraged me to run. And actually, the more I ran—
oh my God, are you running in this heat?
No, but I did for the past 6 months. So
Majine, are you a runner?
Majine is a runner.
Yes, training for a 21K. It's my goal this year.
Oh my God, good for you.
I'll try.
Yeah, good for you. Give it, girl. Go for it. So you started, so under Majine inspired you, Fresh, to get your eyes out on the street.
Yes, so because when you do research, sometimes you're very stuck on your computer. You're very much stuck on the paper, the data that is in front of you. And so I took a walk around the city where I am in Surrey, and I noticed something right away, and that is that a lot of the newly developed areas that are supposed to be safer and more expensive don't have trees. And something that trees do is create better air quality, provide us insulation from heat, and also give in the winter give heat, right? So they have such an essential big role. And you know, when I looked at who was living in these neighborhoods, even though they're newly developed, it was a lot of immigrant colored folks like myself who are living in these newly developed homes. And they're newly like this because they're not even new, to be honest with you. It's more like a 5-10 years kind of age for a home. And then when I would run around and I would enter more white centered neighborhoods within my city, we had big, thick trees. And I had never noticed this before because I read studies about this happening in the States, just like this book. And I had never noticed this before in my city. And it made me think immediately how if I notice this and my city doesn't notice that they're doing this, they're developing, and we have parks now that are surrounded by residential homes to keep these parks safe enough for their families. But really, it's actually pushing out youth that can't afford these neighborhoods, that can't access these public parks anymore because they're within the residential homes. It would take you a long time to get to that unless you live there. So there's a lot happening in my city that I'm not happy with. And my goal with Pivot is something that Pivot was employ me, a young person, you know, a young kind of passionate researcher who had just graduated and who wants to do more work for her city, who wants to do more work for colored people like herself. And I want cities to realize this. It's my ask of cities that I've now said a couple of times in my talks, that I want cities to include smaller scale versions of Pivot in their systems. Why? Because I think that young people deserve to have an opinion and a say in the policies and in the way their cities are being designed. It's not enough to say that we're trying to make 15-minute cities for who, right? Only 50% of youth rent on their own. That is something that we discovered in our report. That is something we heard from people in their interviews. We had one person say, I guess it's cost of transport as well. It's rising. It's, transport keeps rising. It's expensive. We had someone say that they had to transport for 2 hours to get to their school, and how much they were paying. And these are all youth from Toronto, but even youth in Vancouver. I think in Vancouver, 72% of young people live with their families. It's not about that you shouldn't live with your families. It's about the lack of independence, the lack of privacy, the lack of accessibility in your cities. If they can't to live in their cities and understand their cities, who are these cities built for, if not their young people? And that is something that concerns me. That is why I agree. I think these infiltration manuals are amazing. At the same time, I think that my ask right now for cities, that report was written directly the words I chose were for people in the cities working there, deciding whether they should have programs like Pivot, funding programs like Pivot. And
so what's interesting about what you're saying, Freshta, is you're saying take the Pivot model, which had people across the country, and disaggregate that and empower local communities to create their own data hub and involve youth in collecting data and then creating policy options. And what is a great idea. And so, challenge municipal governments to do that, to set, or maybe it's not the municipal government, some other entity to create a local data hub, right?
I ask young people to represent and show your cities reports like this and say, this was written by 3 young people. And if they can do this, I can do this too.
Right.
There's no skill difference or experience difference that I'm lacking. I can write this and I can create research like this and request to them that you can derive this is good data. It's pure data, and you can derive good policy from that.
That's fantastic.
Policy that comes from experience.
Majin, when you're looking at what you see, what would the priority be for you in terms of correcting something that's not working?
I think to answer that question, it's what I see depends on where I am, because I live in Lachine, like I said before, and like it's a great neighborhood, lots of parks, love, access to parks and like canals, and like we all have all the infrastructure that we need. However, I spend half of my time in Saint-Michel, which is in Montreal. It's one of the most racially diverse and one of the poorest also neighborhood in Montreal. And there's a lot of people like Indians in there. I was born and raised in Montreal, my parents from Haiti, and there's a lot of like Haitians, Hispanic people living in like Saint-Michel. And I'm talking about this because I think when people ask, when you look outside, what do you see? It's not the same depending on where you are. So for example, I think one of the things we saw with COVID is that census data show that how race, housing, and income correlate to the spread of like COVID-19. And in Saint-Michel, what people saw is that a lot of people in Saint-Michel, a lot of people, from, Haiti or like Latin America, a lot of them were working in the health sector as nurses or like auxiliary, helping people with the, in the different centers. And that's where the spread of the COVID in Montreal was one of the fastest. A lot of people died from that. And I don't just think it's not enough to ask people necessarily, what do they see? What I see is that, Saint-Michel from Lachine is like a 20-minute trip, but like this 20 minutes is like this literally 2 different worlds. And as a young person, I've been trying to do that, after Pivot, it's not only to focus on the city where I live in Lachine, but also, where my uncles and cousins, where they're actually living, and in terms of opportunity for young people. I think, yes, the report that, for example, Freshta and I worked on is, a good start. However, I've had the chance to work for a town city hall for the past 7 years, like before I joined AJA, and I've worked in many departments, legal, finance, taxes, HR, lots of departments in 7 years. And I feel like maybe one of the reasons why people don't necessarily go to the municipal authorities to try to make change is because people used to go to the town to talk about their taxes, talk about the streets, talk about the buildings and everything, but there's a lot of other issues that necessarily affect youth, except for the cost of living. I wouldn't say that young people between 15 and 29 are particularly interested of like the repair the holes on like Argyle Street. It's not necessarily their main point of concern. So I'm just saying that, because I saw that, and even though I was working there, I didn't see a lot of young people get involved. And, they would have like the city council once a month, or the whole public was invited to come and talk about the issues. But it would always be these people like in their 30s, 40s, like established with a good home and family. And I think young people, like, in my age, they don't necessarily think, and this is something I've also observed with like the report that, Freshta, Reg and I worked on, is that I don't think a lot of people think that the municipalities have power. However, we're always asking them, what can you do for your city? And with the municipal elections coming up, I feel like maybe a lot of people think that, with some issues, for example, like cost of living, health issues, I think a lot of people think that the municipalities are not really the stop to make, but maybe it's more about, the prevention, the federal issues. So not a lot of people go vote on the municipal elections. However, we keep telling them to get involved with their cities. So I just think like there's a discrepancy there, right? So either we give the city more powers to bring young people to the table and actually make changes that are going to get implanted to the provincial or federal government, or we change things around. We tell people, no, okay, just go to the federal, the provincial government. So I just feel like there's also something that should be taken into consideration, the different like infrastructure of powers there.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that we hear a lot, that, as you say, people, and one of the dilemmas we've got, there's this concept subsidiarity, which is a big fancy concept. Somebody will put it in the chat, which is basically a European thing, but where the order of government closest to the recipient of the service should be responsible for funding it, designing it, and held accountable for it. And like housing, for instance. And one of the dilemmas that we've got is that housing, for instance, every government can blame every other government for what's happening in housing because no single level is responsible. So you're onto something really critical, Magine, and I'm hoping that your generation will be the one to change it. Could you just get on that? Where basically municipal governments need more money, and they need more direct authority, and they need the resources, so that you and I and all of us can hold an order of government accountable, so they can't just blame each other all the time, right? But it is interesting that when you talk, the way you guys talk about making change happen, you may, in fact, without even realizing it yet, you may be creating the model of the future. And maybe that's more local engagement, more. COVID may have forced us to do this. Raj, what do you think? You've been doing Youthful Cities for a while. What do you see as the kind of critical thing? Magine just opened the constitutional question, which is a brave thing to do, but what do you see as the priority in terms of addressing something that's not working?
Yeah, for sure. So I think I quickly begin by saying, when we looked at our data, top 5 issues across Canada in these cities: cost of living, good jobs, diversity and inclusion, public safety, climate change, and public health. So 5 to 6 of those issues were the top 5 in all major cities across Canada. Now we're talking about the municipal election. There's one coming up in Calgary, one in Montreal, likely a federal election coming up.
And one in Edmonton.
Prior to that, yep, and Edmonton, yep, and then very likely federal election coming up September, October, from the rumors I'm hearing. We're talking about this concept of youth not being involved, with youth voices not being heard. From our data, we noticed less than 25% of youth said that they feel like their opinions are being heard and listened to by their elected officials. Less than 25%.
Wow.
Less
so
than 15.
So 75% feel they're not being heard at all.
Exactly. Less than 15%. 1.5 said the city's actually making enough of an effort to provide opportunities for engagement. So
wow.
If we expect, now the question becomes is, are cities actually interested in listening to youth and actually creating those opportunities, or is this performative action? I'm watching the city candidates in Calgary here going on about a lot of things, and I feel like they're very disconnected from what youth really need, what youth really want. The cities that we're creating in the next 10 years are for this generation that's 15 to 30. They're going to be the ones leading these cities, whether that's economically or socially or environmentally. And if we're just performing on this concept and using it as a political capture moment, I think there's a lot of issues with that. So in Calgary, there's a lot of talk about arts and entertainment in downtown Calgary. converting buildings to residential. Great concepts, probably also needed, but let's not forget that if cost of living isn't there, good luck with attracting youth to that downtown core. The other aspect here is that I was reading this article and it really connected with me. This individual said in that article that cities are often handing secondhand futures to their citizens and getting them to aspire to them, and that's basically what's happening. We get these professionals to sit at a table, engage business communities, and let's create a future, envision a future for our city, 10, 20, 30 year vision, and then provide that report to the cities to get their feedback. No, that's not how it works. Let's get that feedback first. Let's engage the citizens first before we actually put those reports together. And a lot of talk here, a lot of individuals also talking about these 15-minute cities. Huge topic that I saw during the pandemic, and it's very interesting because the reality of that 15-minute city is, first of all, if you look, at least in Calgary, I'm living in a 15-minute city, but would I really want to walk from my home to the transit station? We're measuring distance and time, but we're not measuring and creating cities based on human census. Let's create cities as storytelling moments, right? Why would we want to? What attracts us to walk from our homes to the transit station? It's not distance or time, because clearly that's not working. And these 15-minute cities, the background really is that it comes from this approach of the neighborhood unit from the 1900s, and that neighborhood unit was about segregation. It was about segregating the populations, white privilege, getting into the suburbs where the school is in the center and you have like this open field in the center and everything else is pushed to the outskirts. So when we're talking about creating these hyperlocal cities and communities and 15-minute communities, let's stop measuring distance and time. Let's actually engage the individuals that have lived experiences and see what do they really need in a community for it to function.
Wow.
So there's a lot of talk. There's a lot of topics.
That's fantastic. I mean, let's come on, guys, take on this. Like, you should just challenge the 15-minute city. It needs to be critiqued, right? And it's a throwback to time is money and time is important. That's a question you're raising, Raj. I mean, maybe it's a 40-minute city and the 40 minutes is a fantastic 40 minutes and you're exposed to all sorts of stuff and you get all sorts of experience. And why does it all have to be fast in 15 minutes? Great questions. We're going to run out of time and I want to be on with you guys for all afternoon. Veronica, let's go to you quickly in terms of a particular, and I'll come to you, Michael, to clean up, and we really do need to end in 4 minutes. So judge yourself accordingly. Veronica, challenge that you see that you think needs fixing and how?
Yeah, I want to jump on the theme of what we've been talking about. And I think what I feel like there's the most opportunity to think about is how we're looking at solving both the challenges that are coming out of COVID and beyond that, the structural and systemic issues we're talking about. And I think just building off of what Raj, what you were talking about, how cities were built based on discriminatory and racist planning practices. And so what needs to happen is that needs to be completely flipped to the extreme. And when we're talking about any sort of solution coming out of the pandemic, when we're talking about building back better, we can't be having those conversations if there isn't a young person at the table. There absolutely has to be a young person, somebody who has the lived experience and who is closest to the ground in terms of the impacts that they're feeling. And I think that's the challenge with building solutions at a time when really extreme shocks are being felt, is that those who are most vulnerable to those shocks are still trying to survive and are trying to make it through, and don't necessarily always have the time and capacity to be coming to consultations and engagement tables. And so we really have to be thinking about how we're having those conversations and also how we're compensating people's time when they are part of those decision-making conversations. And I think a huge gap in particular for young people, I think often we can talk about how young people don't trust in government, young people don't show up to city council, but a lot of those spaces aren't made for youth, and sometimes extending an invitation isn't actually enough. But what needs to happen is you need to design how you're going to have those conversations with youth at the table up front, so that when you are inviting youth to the table, they do show up and they do want to be there. And I want to leave the last 2 minutes for Michael. I feel like you deserve the final mic drop.
Yeah. Well, before I hand that mic drop over to Michael, just a couple of things. One is to say that, I want to talk to you guys again and again, because I was your age in the 80s. There were no jobs and people were really disaffected. And you've got an interesting moment here to seize this leadership. All the instincts that you guys are surfacing are bang on. You're the ones that need to craft the future for yourselves, and the rest of us will enjoy whatever it is you come up with. So, and with our support, we'll be in those outer circles, Michael, that you've suggested. And we need to be helping create those enabling conditions for you guys. So CUI will take this on. We need a kind of ongoing goosing from youth around how do we actually have this, have you own your own agenda. So Michael, last words to you really quick, okay? I only got a minute.
The only thing I want to add here is that throughout this pandemic and the specific example of CERB, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, the federal government especially has demonstrated how flexible and financially capable governments can be in a short period of time if they perceive something to be a crisis. When are we going to start talking about the realities that young people are facing as a crisis and governments reacting at all levels accordingly? That's all I'm going to say.
Yeah.
Thank you for having me.
I mean, you're welcome. I mean, the important thing here is that we don't want to lose this moment of learning, right? And to use the word of COVID, which is pivot, which was the word of the project that you guys worked on, and everybody's pivoting. Let's collectively agree that we're going to pivot together, to work together to create cities for the future and cities for now that actually embrace what young people are saying is the future that they want to create, because the future is yours, and these cities are ready for you guys to shape them the way you need, what you need these cities to be. So thank you so much for joining us. This is our last City Talk for this season. We're going to take a bit of a break over the summer, and then we're coming back in the fall and launching City Talk Global into the US. And so we're looking forward to having a broader conversation with Canadians, and we have lots of Americans who tune in, and we have Americans who participate, but we want to make this as much as we can a continental conversation, because there's so much that we share, and cities are, I always say cities are potentially humanity's greatest invention. We elect to live in close proximity to each other. We choose to do that, many of us. And so we have to get it right. And we need to have informed voices and lived experience. And so thank you for bringing your experience. Thanks for the work you did at Pivot. Thanks for the things you tried, the lessons you learned. And let's figure out how we leverage that to the next step. So Freshta, thanks. Raj, nice to see you. Veronica, great to have you. Enjoy that fan. Majine, I hope Lachine, the canal, keeps you cool. And Michael, always great to have you on with us in City Talk. And I want to thank all my colleagues that have produced City Talk for the last several months. We're going to take a bit of a break, but they've worked so hard, and we've produced some really stuff. This will get posted. Watch it again and again. And as we say, this is never the end of the conversation. It's only the beginning. I've got your phone numbers, gang. So I'm coming back to you for us to continue to work on this together, and stay cool as best you can. Let's get through this one. Thanks, everybody.